When people hear the words Europeans and slavery together, it's usually in the context of the transatlantic slave trade, the mass enslavement of Africans by European colonial powers. When it comes to learning about slavery in school, this undoubtedly horrific and dark chapter in world history is often presented as the slave trade. Unfortunately, little attention is paid to the fact that Arab and Turkic powers held a monopoly on African slavery before the transatlantic slave trade, running their own in parallel. What is more unsettling is the almost complete neglect of attention given to a contemporaneously occurring and pre-existing slave trade in white Europeans. For many centuries, white slaves from the Mediterranean coasts, from Northern Europe, and most prevalently Eastern Europe, were bound in chains as a result of raids and conquests by Islamic powers. While some would argue that the Islamic slave trade in Europe was not as impactful as the transatlantic slave trade because of the scale and social legacy of the latter, it does not justify neglecting the suffering of millions of European slaves. Another argument is that Africans were enslaved because of their race, and so it was discriminate, whereas the enslavement of white Europeans was not. Given the following evidence, this is not at all the case for the latter. In the Quran, it is not permitted to enslave a fellow Muslim. However, this becomes blurred with regards to non-Muslims. Many rulers opted to enslave Christians because it was bypassing theological restrictions. From the 8th century, the Moors of North Africa ruled over the Iberian Peninsula. The enslavement of the white Christians is well documented in administrative surveys from the period, and many slaves from Central, Southern and Eastern Europe were bought and sold as sakaliba, a term referring to slaves from Eastern Europe initially. By the 11th and 12th centuries, Muslim Arab Caliphates and Turkic groups such as the Seljuks and Mongols were notorious for their large-scale trade in Eastern European slaves. Slavic peoples were enslaved on such a massive scale by Turkic and Arabic slavers, from the medieval period to early modern periods, that the name Slav, from Latin sclaveni, was adopted as the English word slave. Process that for a moment. So prevalent were Slavic victims of Islamic slavery that their name became synonymous with the cruel act in the English language. Roughly between 1500 and 1700, the Tatars of Crimea ran a lucrative slave trade for the Ottomans, capturing between 1.5 to 2 million Europeans. The majority of these slaves were from around the Black Sea region and further inland in Eastern Europe. Kaffa, now called Feodosia, was a bustling slave hub for centuries. Famously, the wife of Suleiman I, known in the West as Roxolana, was a Ruthenian taken by Crimean Tatars. In the eastern steppes of Ukraine, the Nogai Khanate captured hundreds of thousands of slaves between the 15th and 18th centuries, leading to the increased militarization of the Zaporizhian Cossacks. Around the Caucasus and Russian lands, the Muslim Khivan slave trade saw the annual enslavement of up to tens of thousands of Russian slaves from the 17th to 19th centuries, when the lands were finally conquered by the Russian Empire, putting an end to the trade. While the overall number of victims in this region will never be known, we can say based on evidence that up to 3 million people in Eastern Europe were enslaved by the Tatar, Khivan and Nogai raiders from the 16th to 19th centuries. European slaves were usually subject to labour in the case of men, and sexual slavery when it came to women, as they would fill the harems and residences of various wealthy households. As we've seen through the activity of their vassals, the Ottomans had a central role in the enslavement of Europeans. Alongside chattel slavery of white Europeans, described by 16th century Flemish diplomat Egilsson de Busbecq as the commonest kind of Turkish merchandise, the Ottomans also founded a unique practice. By the turn of the 15th century, the Ottomans had initiated a levy of Christian children in the Balkans. This was known as the Devshirme. The young boy, unable to fight back and more easily manipulated, was forcibly taken from his home, converted to Islam, circumcised, and made into an obedient and deadly slave soldier called Yeniseri, Janissary, meaning new corps or new soldier. At times, 400 young boys could be taken from their villages on the orders of an Ottoman official. According to one Greek Orthodox metropolitan in the late 14th century, Isidore Glabas, the Ottomans would deceive settlements by offering terms of surrender, declaring that no children would be taken, though this was rarely respected and usually resulted in women and children being carried off to servitude. By the 16th century it had become a levy to ensure a consistent flow of new personnel. The practice of the devshirme was feared and loathed for centuries, as countless European children were snatched from their families, in part because it made for an easily moulded servant, as the children would have no existing allegiances, and also because it was within the legal boundaries of Sharia. For almost 3 centuries, the Janissaries were almost exclusively of Balkan Christian origin. Beyond the devshirme, the Ottomans also conducted raids around the Mediterranean with the help of their other vassals, the Barbary corsairs of North Africa. These pirates and slavers were the scourge of the Mediterranean in the early modern period. They raided Greece, Sicily, southern France, England and Ireland, when in 1631 they sacked Baltimore in County Cork, abducting the locals, who were most likely transported to the slave markets in Algiers, never to return home again. The Barbary trade reached as far north as Iceland, when Grindavik and Vestmannaeyjar were raided in 1627. The experience of one slave, Olafur Egilsson, is attested in his memoirs. It is estimated that 1.25 million Europeans were enslaved by the Barbary corsairs from the 16th to 19th centuries, when the British and French navies bombarded their cities in North Africa, demanding the release of European slaves and putting an end to the slave trade there. The French takeover of Algeria is in part attributed to their campaign to stamp out the Barbary slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade and all its horrors must be taught and studied within a general study of world slavery. For a long time now, Europeans have been emphasised as the enslaver, never the enslaved. Painting Europeans as the sole promulgators of slavery is an ongoing issue in world relations that does more harm than good. Modern European states are at times expected to issue public apologies for slavery, to usher change in social and political policy because of historical injustices, and to issue reparations. If European nations are confronted with the notion of paying reparations, by that logic, so too should Turkey, Algeria and Mongolia. Mauritania, the last country to abolish slavery by doing so in 1981, surely has a lot to answer for. Better yet, we should spend this energy and attention on eliminating practices in South Asia, the Arab world and sub-Saharan Africa, where to this day untold millions of people remain in bondage. This video is not intended to discount the suffering and experiences of African slaves, but to highlight the voices of millions of Europeans who suffered in chains throughout the centuries, and to put into perspective the fact that numerous non-European and Muslim majority countries, who had held sway over millions of slaves throughout history, continued to subject human beings to inhumane labour and enslavement.